Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman. We're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess game. Today's game is a game between, well, the person who sent it in was taking a lesson with someone rated 2000, and they decided as part of the lesson they would play a game against the computer, but of course they didn't want to play a computer at the highest level. So they set Stockfish to a rating of about 1900. Now the computer ratings are notoriously usually optimistic. So I don't think Stockfish is really playing at a 1900 level, but it's obviously not anywhere near its top level. So let's take a look at the game, see what we can learn. Okay, so the engine is white. I'm going to put black at the bottom since those are the humans. E4, E5, knight C3, Vienna, knight F6. And now the main line is the Vienna gambit, F4, when black is supposed to play D5, break move with break move. If you don't know this, if you play E4, E5 and you don't know this line, it's a good line to learn for black because you can easily get messed up if you don't know the Vienna gambit and you're playing E5 for black. Instead, the computer just plays knight F3 and offers a 4 knights game. White plays knight to C6. And now white has several moves. He could play bishop to B5. He can play the gambit-y kind of line knight to D5. He can play D4. The computer plays D4. White takes, that's the best way to save the pawn, is to just trade it off. Sorry, black takes, white takes on D4, knight takes D4. So this resembles a Scotch. What's this? How does this differ from a Scotch? Well, in a Scotch, white plays knight F3, knight C6, D4, pawn takes, knight takes. And now there is a line where white plays knight to F6, but white's best move here isn't to transpose into this game with knight C3. It's to play knight takes C6, and after pawn takes, then play E5, knight D5, something like C4. But black can also throw in queen E7 here first to pin the pawn. Queen E7, queen E2, now knight D5, now C4, now bishop A6, pinning that pawn. So that's a line that Kasparov made popular for the white side. But in this game, instead, when we reach this position, it's as if white, instead of playing knight takes C6 in the Scotch, plays the rarer move, knight C3, and now black's supposed to equalize with bishop B4. Instead, the 2000 player plays bishop to C5 here, which I don't think is quite as accurate. And as you'll see in another move or two, that black's not familiar with what's going on now. White plays bishop E3, and now black blunders. White's threatening to play knight takes C6 and win a piece here. So black certainly understood that, but his way of defending it was not correct. He plays queen E7. So if you want, you can stop the video now and figure out what you would do for white. And the computer played its best idea here. It plays knight F5, attacking the queen and the pawn on G7. The queen goes back to F8 to guard G7, but now the queen is overworked. The queen is trying to guard the bishop and the G7 pawn, so white can simply play knight takes G7 check. And if black wants to castle later, he's going to have to give up the pawn and the bishop pair. So he takes the knight. Black takes bishop takes C5. So white's completely winning here. White has the bishop pair. He has an extra pawn. He has the better pawn structure. But as we said, Stockfish is not set to the highest level, so we're still in for some interesting play. D6, bishop E3. So now black, who's, as I said, is a 2000 instructor, realizes, all right, well, I need to mix it up here because if I just play normally, when you're losing, you want things to be complicated. So black plans here on castling queen side, where he has the better pawn structure anyway, even though the bishop is attacking the pawn on A7. So black plays bishop G4. By the way, Stockfish 11, which I'm using to help analyze the game, now has white up by about 2.7 pawns, which is plenty to win the game. So white plays F3, black plays bishop E6, and now the engine says white's best move is knight to b5. I guess discouraging castling because of knight takes check, although that's complicated. White plays queen to e2, just getting ready to castle queenside, but he is blocking in his bishop that way. I'm sure the human would not do that. So black says, all right, well, I have nothing better than castling queenside, and now white plays knight to b5. And now Stockfish says black should counterattack in the center with d5. For instance, if you play d5 and white tries to trade off those pawns and then win the a pawn, it doesn't work. For instance, pawn takes, knight takes, hitting the bishop. Let's say he plays knight takes check. Black can play knight takes. And if white plays bishop takes, black can not only try to trap the bishop with b6, which probably fails to queen a6 check, king d7, but just play queen takes b2 first. And if white saves the rook with rook d1, you can fork him, and all kinds of crazy things are happening. And black's actually completely winning here. So let's go back to the game. So black can get away with d5, but black doesn't calculate that. He simply plays the natural king to b8. If he had played d5, white should play e5, and white's advantage would be down to 1.5 or so. By playing king b8 instead of d5, black's disadvantage remains about 2.5 pawns. Okay, so white castles queenside. Still needs a way to get this bishop off of f1. Black puts the rook on the same line with the queen. It's not Soldis's principle, but I first read in Andy Soldis's book, Grandmaster Secrets of the Openings, that the opening principle that has the fewest exceptions is develop a rook to the same file where your opponent develops his queen. And that would be true even if there's pawns in the way. If the file is completely locked, maybe it doesn't do anything. But if the file is dynamic, in just this case there's a semi-open file, black can do break moves against the e4 pawn. So it makes sense to have the rook on the same line with the queen. And it makes sense here to move the queen out of the way if for no other reason than you want to get the bishop in the game. So white plays the move a3. I don't think what black again was really threatening bishop takes a2 because his bishop would get trapped with b3. Black plays knight d7, shuffling his pieces toward the queen side where the white king is. White finally does move the queen, but he does move it on the same line with another rook. He could have played queen to f2. Stockfish says that queen d2, though, is the best move. Black plays knight b6. White plays knight d4, best move, just forcing some trades by forking the knight and the bishop. Black says, all right, I'll keep the knight on the board. Here, Stockfish 11 suggests white should play queen c3 with about a 2-pawn advantage. White plays the weakening move b3. So black's really starting to get back in the game now. White has refused to develop his bishop, and his rook are in the corner. Black's 2 rooks are in the center, which we'd expect a 2000 player to get his rooks into the game. So Stockfish 1900, the one that's playing white, not the one that's analyzing the game for me, which is Stockfish 11, which is rated about 3500. Stockfish 11 says that Stockfish 1900 there as white, his lead is down to about 1.5 pawns. So now black decides to break the center. He has nothing better, and that gets the rook into play. White moves the king out of the way, but now pawn takes pawn will create a pin on the knight where black will be threatening c5, which means that white can't recapture while he saves the piece. So after pawn takes pawn, white has to stop c5, and he doesn't have time to recapture here. So white plays bishop to b5, introducing complications. All right, so if you're playing a game like this and somebody plays bishop to b5, you got to take a lot of time on this move because he's threatening to win the exchange on e8. You're threatening to win a piece with c5. You've got to calculate, should I move the rook on e8? Should I block the attack with c6? Should I just go after the pin right away with c5? And if he takes bishop takes e8, maybe I can play e takes d4, hitting his other bishop, and I'm hitting both bishops. This is the kind of complicated thing which makes a large effect on your rating. And figuring out these things right is a really important part of being a good player. And here Stockfish 11 says that black's best move is one that I probably wouldn't find. Bishop d7 with equality. So that's the best move, but black has so many moves here. For instance, if black plays c5 and white plays bishop takes e8 and white plays c takes d4, white can just play bishop b5 and black can't take the bishop because nothing's guarding the rook. So that doesn't work. If black plays c6, white has the very complicated move queen a5. And white has a slight advantage here in all the complications, according to Stockfish 11. If black would simply move the rook, let's say rook f8, then white would play bishop h6 and get a skewer. So let's put the rook on a different square. Let's say he plays rook to g8 and hits the g2 pawn. So now he's threatening the g2 pawn and he's threatening c5. But black can simply play knight takes e6, hitting the queen, so that if rook takes queen, then knight takes queen. So for instance, rook takes d2, knight takes g7, rook takes d1 check, rook takes d1 check. And if black tries to get the piece back with rook takes g7, then rook d8 check, knight c8. And now this knight is guarding the square so the bishop can't go there. So what we do is remove the guard. We pin the knight to the rook, so the knight just can't go anywhere. And after black saves the knight, you just remove the guard, he takes, and now you play bishop d7, threatening mate. And the only way to only lose the exchange, as opposed to losing a piece, is to play rook takes with a completely winning game for white. All right, so there's lots of complications here. And black plays c6. Okay, so now we've got a bishop hanging, we've got the knight pinned, we've got a hanging pawn on e4. Again, these are the kind of positions you want to play really slowly. So what's white's best move here? Well, again, thank goodness I have a 3500 level computer next to me because, even masters get these kind of complications wrong. And here, white should not move the bishop on b5, but counterattack the knight with f4. And Stockfish says white has a slight advantage. Instead, Stockfish 1900, playing white, attacks the queen with bishop h6. And here, the better Stockfish, Stockfish 11, says black should play queen h8 where black now has the advantage. And he does. Very good for the 2000 player. He finds the best move. And white now plays f4, one move too late. And now the computer says black should play knight d3, which removes the queen from guarding the knight on d4 and also opens up the queen on that knight. However, black plays the counter e3. So again, we have pieces hanging all over the board. We have an amazing counting problem. A counting problem is where you say, gee, if I take and he take and I take and he take, who's ahead? Well, that's relatively easy when it's all on one square. But when it's on different squares and you have options of which square you want to take on, those kind of permutations become very difficult. So this is a very difficult counting problem. And Stockfish 11, which of course is pretty much perfect with counting problems, which humans are not, says white should play queen to c3 here. White plays queen to c3. And now it says black should play knight d5, hitting the queen. And they do. So now black is threatening to still take the bishop in some lines. And white, of course, can take the knight after he saves the queen. So there's complications. Queen to a5. Keeping an eye on that a7 pawn and on the rook. But, of course, black has some nice options here. If he takes the bishop and knight takes, then white's threatening queen takes a7 check, and black has to save the knight on e5. So black decides to save the knight on e5 right away by hitting the bishop on h6, saying basically, I'm hitting both bishops now. And white's best move, even though white's worse now, is to play bishop takes c6, which hits the rook, and if he takes back, he has a fork of the rook and the king. White does find that and plays bishop takes c6. And again, great complications. Black can just take the bishop on h6. He could take the bishop on c6 and give up the exchange because the rook's guarded twice with the rook and the queen. He could try a fork here, which doesn't look like the right move because it only wins the exchange. When he could win just a whole piece. Why would you want to win the exchange, a rook for a knight, when you could win an entire bishop? Stockfish says b6 is the best move here. Again, very difficult. That's why I was sent this game, was because of all these complications. And, my advice on these is, yes, you're not going to figure these out right all the time. They're very, very difficult counting problems. But whenever you see positions like this where things are hanging all over the board, please, please, please take your time. That's one reason why you play long time control games. So when you have positions like this, you don't just wing it, but you try to figure it out. And those are the kind of things that help your analysis capabilities and help you get better at chess. All right, so black decides to just take that bishop. And now white should play knight b5. Again, threatening queen takes a7 check. And Stockfish says if white plays knight b5, this game is even. It gives knight b5, knight c3 check, knight takes c3, b takes c6, knight b5 again. The idea is if he takes, you get a perpetual check. Pawn takes, queen takes, king c7, check, king c8, check, king b8, check, king a8, check, draw. Okay, back to the game. So knight b5 gives white a draw. White plays the very human kind of move. Let me take that rook with the bishop. Bishop takes e8. The engine says, oops, white, that's not nearly your best move. Now you're losing. Why? Because when the smoke clears and black takes that bishop, he's going to have a bishop and a knight versus a rook. And let's see, black has 5 pawns, white has 6, and that's not enough for white. If you use the Reinfeld numbers, a rook and a pawn is worth 2 pieces, but if you use more sophisticated numbers, 2 pieces is almost always worth more than a rook and a pawn, and especially in a position like this in the middle game. So black decides to take with the queen. Engine says taking with the rook was much better. It says white should play c4 here with less than a pawn disadvantage, and he does. And now it says black should counterattack with b6 instead of saving the knight. If you're a weak player and somebody hits something with something worth less, usually you just move it. Just play knight c7 or something. But black does find the best move, b6. White plays queen e1, says, well, if you're going to move the knight anyway, maybe I'll get this pawn. And black cleverly pushes the pawn, and now white can't take it with the queen because he loses his queen, so he has to take time to move the rook. So he moves the rook up 1. The engine said he should just take with the knight. If he takes with the knight, then knight e3, and black has a slight advantage. So playing rook d2 instead of just taking the pawn with a knight is a little silly. Black plays his best move, check, to preserve his pawn. White attacks the knight. Where's the knight going to go? Knight's going to attack the rook, and now the rook can't take the pawn. Well, I guess he can, because if rook takes e2, then rook takes d4, rook takes e4. So here, the engine says white should play knight c6 check, and after queen takes c6, rook takes d8 check, king c7, black should be winning. White played just queen takes d2, hopeless, and now black's going to end up way ahead. Knight takes d2, queen takes d2, and black has a piece for 2 pawns, and it's getting to the point where everything else is going to be pretty easy here. Black plays king up to prevent all those tricky knight check moves that we just talked about. White gets out of the pin with queen e3. Black says, let's trade everything off, I can win this endgame. White says, I'll give you a check. Black says, ooh, look, I can intervene with the bishop. You can't take with the pawn because I take your queen. If you take my queen, I have a Zwischenzug, knight takes e4 check when I end up way ahead in the endgame. So very clever move by black. Kind of move that weaker players don't think of. They go, oh, I can't go there. He'll take me with a pawn. Well, that's a quiescence error, because then you would take his queen. So you have to calculate this to see if it works. Obviously, black did. And white trades queens. Now black should play the Zwischenzug. Knight takes d4 check. He just takes there and says, you can't take both pieces. And if you take my bishop, I'm going to take your knight. And if you take my knight, I'm going to check you with the bishop. So he still gets the extra piece. Knight takes, bishop to e4 check, of course. King d2, bishop takes. All right, so if you don't know how to win these kind of positions, where you're up a piece for 2 pawns, we'll still keep going through the game and show you. It's usually not that hard. You can even offer to trade rooks, and then the bishop and the king will go around the board picking off the pawns, because the best white can do is create one isolated passed pawn on each side of the board, and an isolated passed pawn is not going to beat an extra piece. So white offers to trade, and black goes, oh, I know how to win this. Thank you for trading when you're losing. I call this a purposeful error. You don't trade when you're losing unless you think that you can't win with a bishop and a king with when you have 2 extra pawns, but that's almost never going to be true unless there's almost no pawns on the board. So this is a computer, of course, not a human, but if this was a human and he was my student, I'd say to him, don't trade when you're losing. And I'd also say, unless you're 100% sure you're going to get what you want, which is you'll get a draw out of this. And the answer is no. So now black's king is even closer to the center than white's king. So black, of course, is a 2000 player. He knows to bring out his king. And white plays the computer move, king here, which now the black king can get all the way to d4. So that makes this even uninteresting. Let's show you what would have happened if white had played a little better. Let's let Stockfish 11 play both sides. King d2, b5, trying to isolate the pawns. King c3, so that he can take back with the king and not isolate the pawns. Bishop e6, so he can't take with the king. King d4, pawn takes pawn, isolating the pawn. Pawn takes pawn. f6, just keeping the king out of the center. h3, h5, saying you can't play g4 because I win a pawn. King e4, just waiting. h4, making the g-pawn backward. f5 for white. Bishop takes c4. King f4. Bishop e2, keeping the king out of these 3 squares. King e3, hitting the bishop. Bishop d1. King d4, trying to keep the king out. Bishop c2, hitting the pawn. The king can't guard it. King e3. King d5, saying, I can always win this pawn later. If you guard it, I can zigzag you away from it. King f2, realizing that that's going to work. Bishop d1, blocking off the king. King hits the bishop. Bishop a4. King f2. Stockfish says, repeat the position. Now it says g4. Pawn takes en passant. King takes. King e4. King g2. Bishop h5. He says, I can win that pawn anytime. King g3. King takes f5. You get the idea. Now he's got a passed pawn, and white has no extra pawns. So let's go back to the game. That's what would happen if he tried to put up resistance, but it's not that hard. King d1, bad move. King c5. King c1, another bad move. What's he doing with his king? Kings are worth about 4.25 in the endgame, but if you're going to keep them on the first rank like this, they're worth less than the average. Just as if you put a knight on the rim, the future is dim. The king on the rim here, his future is dim in the endgame. King to b2. Black says, thank you for letting me go after your kingside pawns and letting me win them. The best you can do is create a passed pawn, which I can always sack my bishop for. King c3, king f2. Here comes the king finally. Thank you for all your pawns. Hits the bishop. Now the bishop should probably stay guarding this side of the board. So playing bishop g6 is probably not the best move, because this is where the extra pawn is. White says, okay, I'll create a passed pawn. Black says, I'll take another pawn. White says, passed pawn. Now black realizes, I got to do something with this bishop right away, because if I wait too long here, white's going to win. So he plays bishop there, and the idea is to play bishop e2 and bishop a6 just in time. c6, bishop. Here he attacks the pawn. He's perfectly willing to sack the bishop for the pawn now that he's up an extra pawn. Bishop there. And now white can bring his king down to try to stop him. But meanwhile, black's going to have plenty of time to win the game. So white says, I'll just try to go after your other pawn and get a passed pawn. Black says, all right, but you can't take this pawn without me taking this pawn, and then I win. Takes, takes. And now white needs to try to get to the 5th rank because this pawn is going to move 2 on the next move. But he can't do it, which means this pawn is going to queen in 5 moves. So white says, all right, can't go that way, I'll go this way. Black says, all right, let me know when you want me to give up the bishop for the pawn. And I stopped recording the game here. I think they gave it all the way, you know, computers play it all the way out to mate. But, you know, you don't have to do that here. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed this game and you found it instructive. There were a lot of good counting things in this amateur game. And, you know, if you liked the video, hit the like button. If you want to subscribe and you haven't, do so. If you'd like to tell your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess, thanks a lot. See you next time. Bye.